In the pine-dark hollows of 1848 Alabama, one boy walked alone. They never saw him kill. They only saw what he left behind. And every grown man in Milbrook learned to cross himself when the sun went down, because Thomas Hartwell was coming. The voice fades into the low drone of a distant river and the crack of dry branches underfoot. Imagine a town that no map remembers anymore. Milbrook, Alabama, spring 1848. Not a dot on the page. Just a scar between the Tallapoosa River and 10,000 acres of longleaf pine that smelled like resin and secrets. 800 souls lived there, breathing the same red clay dust, sharing the same well water, and pretending the forest didn't watch them back. The main street was 2 wagon ruts wide. A general store with a sagging porch. A blacksmith whose hammer rang like a church bell at odd hours. A white-steepled church whose bell tolled only for funerals and the 4th of July. Houses leaned against one another the way frightened people do, some plank shacks still oozing sap, a few brick ones pretending they had come from Charleston money. Beyond the last fence line the pines rose straight and black, their trunks scarred by lightning, their needles whispering even when there was no wind. The summers here didn't just burn. They cooked the air until it tasted of iron. Winters brought ice that could snap a man's arm if he fell wrong on the frozen riverbank. The soil was stubborn red clay that stained every hem and every memory the same color. Most families had been rooted here since the 1820s, grandparents buried under mossy stones behind the church, children born in the same iron bedsteads. They carried the stubborn pride of people who had already survived one wilderness and refused to admit another one waited just past the tree line. The Hartwells arrived in 1835 when Thomas was still a baby wrapped in a faded quilt. William Hartwell was a carpenter who could read Latin and draw a perfect mortise and tenon joint with his eyes closed. Tall, quiet, hands always smelling of pine shavings and linseed oil. Catherine came from a merchant family in Charleston. She had married beneath her station, as her mother wrote in letters that arrived once a year like accusations. Her hands were soft when she first stepped off the wagon, within 2 years they were cracked and bleeding from lye soap and laundry water. She never complained out loud. She simply stopped smiling in church. They had 2 children. Thomas, born 1832 on a night when the river ran unusually high. And little Margaret in 1836, who cried so seldom people sometimes forgot she was in the room. Early on, Thomas seemed ordinary. He walked to the winter schoolhouse with the other boys, slate under his arm, boots too big for his feet. He learned his letters. He learned his numbers. He sat still while the schoolmaster read from the Bible. But when the others ran screaming into the woods after lessons, Thomas slipped away alone. Neighbors later remembered him building tiny cities out of sticks and stones, perfect grids, perfectly square. They remembered him lying on his belly for hours watching a line of ants carry a dead moth, eyes unblinking, as if he were reading their thoughts. They remembered the way he could imitate the exact call of a screech owl so convincingly that real owls answered him from the dark. None of it felt wrong at the time. Just different. Like a child who had already been let in on a secret the rest of them were still too young to hear. Then came the spring of 1841. Thomas was 9. Eleanor Vance, daughter of the town physician, wandered into the forest chasing a butterfly and never came out. 3 days. 3 nights. The whole town searched. Men carried lanterns until the oil ran dry. Women stood on porches wringing aprons, listening for a child's cry that never came. Dr. Vance aged 10 years in 72 hours. His wife walked the tree line at dawn calling her daughter's name until her voice cracked like river ice. On the morning of the 4th day, the church bell began to toll slow and hopeless. And then Thomas Hartwell stepped out of the mist at the edge of the square. He was barefoot. Mud to his knees. His dark hair plastered to his forehead. In his small hand he held Eleanor's, limp and dirty but alive. The girl's eyes were wide, unfocused, as though she had seen something that had no name in any language the town knew. "Where did you find her?" they asked. Thomas looked up with those pale gray eyes, eyes that would later be called wolf-colored behind closed doors, and answered simply. "She was crying. I followed the sound." He had stayed with her through the night, he said. Kept her warm. Led her home at first light. The town wept with relief. They clapped him on the back. They called him a hero. The Vance family pressed coins into William's hand. Eleanor herself never spoke of that night again. When pressed, she only stared at the floor and whispered, he knew the way out. But something had changed. A 9-year-old boy had walked into 10,000 acres of trackless pine and come out holding a lost child like a shepherd carrying a lamb. People began to watch him differently. Not with gratitude. With a quiet, crawling question. How did he know exactly where to look? The years rolled on like the river, steady, brown, unstoppable. Thomas grew lean and sharp-featured. Dark hair that never quite sat right. Those pale gray eyes that seemed to catalog every movement in a room before anyone else noticed. He was polite. He was quiet. He read every book his father owned, natural philosophy, Euclid, even a battered volume of Milton that Catherine kept hidden because it spoke too freely of fallen angels. He spent entire days in the forest. Collecting insects, pressing leaves, sketching the way a hawk's wing folded when it stooped. Once he brought home a perfect skeleton of a fox, every bone wired together so cleanly it looked like it had died smiling. His father saw genius. The boy. "We'll leave this town," William would say at the supper table, voice thick with pride. "He'll study in the north. Become something." His mother saw something else. Catherine would watch Thomas across the table and feel a cold finger trace her spine. She loved him. God help her, she loved him. But love and fear can share the same bed in a small house. She began to pray longer in the evenings, fingers white around her rosary beads even though the church was Methodist. By 1846 the town had settled into a comfortable lie. Thomas Hartwell was odd, yes. Brilliant, certainly. But harmless. The kind of boy small towns produce once a generation, the one who reads too much and fits in nowhere. They smiled at him on the street. They let their children play near him. They told themselves the earlier unease had been nothing but the panic of a missing girl and a clever child's luck. That lie died in April 1847. It began on Henry Prescott's farm. Tuesday morning. Prescott walked out to check his livestock and found them arranged in the center of the pasture like pieces on a chessboard no one had taught him how to play. 3 cows. 2 pigs. 1 horse. All dead. No blood. No wounds. No sign of struggle. Their bodies laid out with mathematical precision, heads pointing exactly to the 4 cardinal directions, legs arranged as though they had knelt before dying. Prescott stood in the dew-soaked grass and felt his breakfast rise in his throat. This was not the work of wolves. Wolves tear and scatter. This was deliberate. Like an altar. He ran for Constable James Garrett. Garrett, a thick-shouldered man who had buried 3 of his own children and still believed in order, knelt beside the bodies. Dr. Vance examined them. No poison they could detect. No disease. Just death. And then careful, loving arrangement. 2 weeks later it happened again on Robert Thorne's land. Chickens, a goat, and Thorne's old hunting dog. This time arranged in a perfect circle, noses inward, as though listening to something only they could hear. Then a 3rd time. Then a 4th. 7 farms in 6 weeks. The patterns grew more elaborate, concentric rings, spirals, angles that hurt the eye to follow. Sometimes the animals were livestock. Sometimes wild things, raccoons, possums, trapped and carried there. Always dead without visible cause. Always arranged with a boy's patience and a scholar's precision. The town began to come apart at the seams. Women stopped letting children play past the fence line. Men sat up all night with lanterns and rifles, eyes burning, nerves raw. Whispers slithered from porch to porch, witchcraft, Indian curses left over from the old Creek Wars, the devil himself come to Alabama in the shape of geometry. The most terrifying theory was the simplest: a person was doing this. A person clever enough, quiet enough, cruel enough to kill without noise and arrange without hurry. Then Samuel Hutchkins, 14, same age as Thomas, came forward. He had seen Thomas in the woods past midnight, cradling something dead in his arms. A goat, he thought. The boy moved like he belonged to the dark. Constable Garrett brought Thomas in. The boy stood in the jailhouse calm as still water. His notebook was produced, pages of meticulous owl sketches, notes on their silent flight, their killing methods. He explained, voice soft and reasonable, that he had simply been observing nocturnal creatures. He had not carried any animal. He had not arranged anything. He never raised his voice. He never blinked too much. And the killings stopped the very next night. To the town, that was confession enough. Evidence? They had none. But absence of evidence, when it suits the fear, becomes proof. William Hartwell raged at the constable, demanded proof, called the whole thing a witch hunt against a boy who was simply different. His fury only made it worse. Why defend the boy so fiercely unless the father knew something unspeakable? Catherine stopped going to church. She moved through town like a ghost, eyes sunken, mouth set in a line that had forgotten how to smile. Neighbors said she looked like a woman carrying a sin too heavy for one soul. Thomas himself? He kept walking to the woods. Kept reading. Kept watching people with those pale gray eyes that seemed to measure the weight of their souls. And the town learned a new kind of silence. They still said good morning on the street. But they crossed to the other side when he passed. They locked their barns at dusk. They told their children new bedtime stories, stories about a boy who knew the way through the forest because the forest itself had taught him things no child should ever learn. By the end of 1847, the animal killings had faded from open talk. But they had not been forgotten. They had become the first chapter in the legend of Thomas Hartwell. The boy the entire town was afraid of. And the worst of it, the part that kept grown men awake, was the creeping, biblical suspicion that the real horror hadn't even begun yet. Because if a 9-year-old could find a lost child in 10,000 acres of pine, and a 14-year-old could kill without a sound and arrange death like scripture, what would a 16-year-old be capable of when the town finally pushed him too far? The pines outside Milbrook kept their counsel. But on certain nights, when the wind moved just right, they sounded almost like breathing. And somewhere in the dark between the trees, Thomas Hartwell was still walking. Still watching. Still waiting. The cold that December bit deeper than any winter Milbrook had known. It wasn't just the frost that silvered the pine needles or the way the Tallapoosa River growled under thin sheets of ice. It was the kind of cold that settles behind the eyes, the kind that makes every shadow feel personal. The town had already been living with a low-grade fever of suspicion since the animal killings. Doors that once stayed unlatched now carried heavy iron bolts. Mothers no longer let children wander past the last lamppost after dusk. Even the church bell seemed to toll with a heavier hand, as though warning the faithful that evil no longer hid in the forest it had learned to walk among them wearing the face of a boy. Thomas Hartwell was 16 now, but in the minds of his neighbors he had stopped being a boy long ago. He had become a rumor with legs. A story parents told to keep children obedient. The evidence against him remained thin as river mist, circumstantial whispers, uneasy glances, the convenient timing of stopped atrocities. Yet facts no longer mattered. Fear had written its own scripture, and Thomas was its central verse. Then came the night that shattered whatever fragile peace the Hartwell family still possessed. December 14, 1847. Margaret Hartwell was 12, everything her brother was not. Dark hair like her mother's, sharp intelligent features softened by a child's ready smile. She laughed easily, helped with chores without being asked, and had a circle of friends who adored her. Where Thomas observed the world like a scientist studying specimens, Margaret dove into it with both hands. She was the kind of girl the town instinctively wanted to protect, the bright spot in a hard land. That evening she asked permission to walk the 3 short streets to Sarah Winter's house. A familiar route. Lantern in hand, shawl wrapped tight against the cold. Catherine kissed her forehead, told her to be home before full dark. William nodded from his workbench, wood shavings clinging to his sleeves. Thomas said nothing. He simply watched his sister leave from the doorway, pale gray eyes reflecting the lantern light like twin moons. She never arrived. When the supper hour passed and the lantern's glow did not return, Catherine's worry turned to ice in her veins. William walked to the Winters' home. Sarah's mother met him at the door with a pale face. Margaret had never come. The alarm spread like fire through Dry Pine. Within the hour, Constable Garrett had lanterns moving through every alley, every shed, every barn. By midnight, nearly every able-bodied man in Milbrook was calling Margaret's name into the freezing dark. Their voices echoed off the tree line like prayers no one believed would be answered. Dawn brought no relief. The second day the search widened. Men from neighboring settlements arrived on tired horses. Bloodhounds were brought in, noses to the frozen ground, baying mournfully. The forest, once a source of timber and game, now felt like a living thing that had swallowed a child whole. Ravines, hollows, bear dens, every possible place a frightened girl might hide was combed again and again. The cold deepened. Hope thinned. Then, on the evening of the second day, as exhausted men gathered once more in the town square to organize the next push, Thomas Hartwell walked calmly out of the gathering dusk. He approached Constable Garrett without hurry. His voice was quiet, almost gentle. "I know where she is. I will take you to her." The square fell into a stunned silence. Relief clashed violently with suspicion. How could he know? Had he known all along? Had he taken her? Thomas offered no explanation. He simply turned and began walking toward the tree line. A group of men, Garrett, Dr. Vance, William Hartwell among them, followed. Thomas moved with eerie certainty. No hesitation. No searching for broken branches or footprints. He walked as though the forest had drawn him a map in invisible ink only he could read. 2 hours of hard marching through thickening dark brought them to a small clearing deep in the pines. There, beneath a massive ancient oak whose branches spread like the arms of a crucified man, sat Margaret. She was alive. Physically untouched, no bruises, no torn clothing, no signs of violence. But her eyes were wrong. Wide, unfocused, staring at something only she could see. Her small body trembled though the blankets they wrapped around her offered warmth. She did not cry out for her father. She did not speak. She simply sat, lips slightly parted, as though the words had been stolen from her throat and replaced with silence. The men carried her back like a fragile relic. Dr. Vance examined her thoroughly at his home. No injuries. No evidence of exposure severe enough to explain her state. No sign she had been fed or sheltered by anyone, yet she had survived 2 freezing nights. Physically, she was a miracle. Psychologically, something had been broken that no medicine of the time could name. For weeks Margaret remained locked inside herself. She would sit by the hearth staring into the flames, trembling at sounds no one else heard. When spoken to, she sometimes flinched as though struck. Slowly, painfully, she began to speak again. Short sentences. Quiet voice. The bright, cheerful girl had retreated somewhere deep, leaving a quieter, watchful shadow in her place. But whenever anyone, parents, doctor, even gentle Reverend Thornton, asked what had happened in those 2 days, Margaret would grow agitated. Her hands would shake. Her breathing would quicken. She would shake her head violently and refuse. Eventually the questions stopped. The family learned to live with the silence. The town drew darker conclusions. Thomas had found her exactly as he had found Eleanor Vance years earlier. With impossible certainty. In thousands of acres of forest. Without searching. The official story, repeated in daylight, was that the boy's uncanny knowledge of the woods had saved his sister. But in the private hours, after lamps were turned low and doors bolted, the other story slithered through Milbrook like smoke. What if he had taken her? What if he had hidden her for some purpose only he understood? What if he had returned her only after whatever ritual, lesson, or experiment he intended had been completed? Catherine Hartwell began to unravel in earnest. Her face grew gaunt. Dark circles carved themselves beneath her eyes. She stopped attending church except on the rare Sunday when William forced the issue. She rarely left the house. When she did, she moved like a woman carrying an invisible wound that bled internally. Neighbors whispered that guilt was eating her alive, that a mother knows the truth about her children even when she cannot speak it. William grew more defensive, more isolated. His insistence on Thomas's innocence sounded increasingly desperate, like a man shouting against a rising flood. The town no longer listened. They had chosen their villain. As 1848 dawned, the pattern that had begun with dead animals and a lost girl began to crystallize into something colder, more personal, and far more chilling. Small incidents, each explainable on its own, began to cluster around anyone who crossed Thomas. Charles Ricks, a bully who had mocked Thomas at school, fell from his horse and shattered his leg in 2 places. The break was so vicious Dr. Vance feared amputation. In his fever, Charles swore he had seen Thomas standing in the road just before the horse panicked, those pale gray eyes locked on him, unblinking. Later, when the fever broke, he still insisted on what he had seen. Rebecca Foster, who had laughed loudly at Thomas during a lesson, suffered a cut that turned into a raging infection within hours. The flesh swelled, turned black at the edges. For days it seemed she might lose her hand or her life. She recovered, scarred and subdued, but swore she had seen Thomas across the street that morning, watching her with the faintest smile. Daniel Prescott, the son of the farmer whose livestock had been arranged like an altar, began suffering nightmares so violent he woke screaming, sheets soaked, unable to recall the images but certain something was feeding on his fear. He deteriorated rapidly. He drank to escape. Eventually he fled Milbrook altogether, muttering that Thomas was walking through his dreams like a shadow with teeth. No single event could be proven. No witness could swear to direct harm. Yet the pattern was undeniable. Those who wronged Thomas or even mocked him seemed to invite misfortune that carried the flavor of deliberate cruelty. Mothers began warning children in hushed tones, "Stay clear of the Hartwell boy." Adults crossed the street when they saw him coming. Invitations dried up. Group activities excluded him without explanation. Thomas had become a pariah, not officially banished, but treated as something contagious, something unclean. He accepted the isolation with the same eerie calm he had shown everything else. He still attended school when it was in session. He still vanished into the forest for hours. He still moved through Milbrook like a ghost who had not yet decided whether to haunt or simply observe. But something in him had shifted, his pale gray eyes now carried a quiet knowing. A subtle satisfaction, as though the town's fear was a form of tribute he had long expected and now quietly enjoyed. The boy who once seemed detached now seemed, fed by their dread. The most disturbing incident came one afternoon when 5 older, larger boys, emboldened by liquid courage and the town's collective terror, decided to drive Thomas out of Milbrook for good. They cornered him deep in the woods, armed with sticks and stones, faces twisted with righteous anger. What happened next became legend. The boys gave conflicting accounts afterward, each more unsettling than the last. Some swore Thomas simply stood there, staring with those wolf-colored eyes, and their bodies refused to obey. Limbs grew heavy. Courage evaporated. Others claimed he spoke soft words they could not later recall, yet the memory left them sick with unnamed guilt. Still others said the fear that washed over them was so pure, so primal, they turned and ran as though the devil himself stood before them. They scattered into the pines like frightened deer. When they regrouped later, pale and shaking, they could not explain why 5 against 1 had ended without a single blow. The story raced through town. Thomas had broken them without lifting a finger. He had bent their wills through nothing more than his presence. Whether exaggerated or not, the effect was electric. Fear deepened into something closer to awe-tinged horror. Thomas was no longer merely dangerous. He was something the town could not name, something that could command terror the way a preacher commands a congregation. By spring 1848, Thomas Hartwell, 16 years old, tall and lean with sharp angular features, moved through Milbrook like a living shadow. His pale eyes seemed to peel back the skin of every soul they touched, reading sins no one had confessed, even the church, once the heart of the community, felt tainted by his presence. He still attended services with his parents, sitting in the back pew, back straight, hands folded. Reverend Samuel Thornton, a good and weary man of 60 who had buried more children than he cared to count, found himself increasingly disturbed during sermons. Thomas's stillness was not reverence. It was judgment. The boy listened without emotion, as though weighing the words of God himself and finding them wanting. In April 1848, Reverend Thornton could bear it no longer. He preached a sermon on the nature of evil, how it could wear the face of innocence, how it could hide in plain sight, how a community must remain vigilant to protect the pure from the corrupt. He never spoke Thomas's name. He did not need to. Every eye in the congregation flicked toward the back pew. Thomas sat motionless through the entire sermon. No flinch. No anger. No guilt. When it ended, he rose with his parents and walked out into the spring sunlight as though the words had washed over him like rain over stone. But the town felt it in their bones. The boy the entire town feared had just been accused from the pulpit. And he had smiled inside. The pines outside Milbrook continued their ancient whispering. The river kept its secrets. And somewhere in the growing silence between the Hartwell house and the white steeple, something ancient and biblical stirred. Because in the scripture of Milbrook, 1848, the question was no longer whether Thomas Hartwell was dangerous. It was whether the town had already invited divine retribution, by daring to judge what they could never understand. The smile was small. Barely a lifting at the corners of the mouth. Yet it cut deeper than any sermon Reverend Samuel Thornton had ever preached. As Thomas passed the old minister at the church door that April Sunday in 1848, their eyes met for one heartbeat too long. Pale gray meeting weary, faithful brown. Then the smile. Not mocking. Not triumphant. Something worse, something knowing, almost pitying, as though Thomas had already read the final verse of the Reverend's life and found it predictable. That night, in the quiet of his study, Reverend Thornton felt a sudden, crushing weight behind his left eye. His left arm went numb. His leg buckled. He collapsed across his open Bible, pages smeared with ink from the sermon he had been preparing. Dr. Vance was summoned in haste. The diagnosis was a severe apoplexy, a stroke that stole half the man's strength and slurred the words that had once thundered from the pulpit. He survived. Barely. But the left side of his face would droop forever. His left hand would never grip a hymnal again. His voice, once clear and full of the Holy Spirit, now came out broken and wet, like gravel dragged through river mud. The town needed no courtroom to render its verdict. Thomas had looked at the Reverend. Thomas had smiled. And the man of God had been struck down. Whispers turned to open declarations in the general store, on porches, inside the blacksmith's heat. He's not natural. He carries something inside him, something older than sin. The devil doesn't need horns when he can wear the face of a carpenter's son. Biblical language flooded the conversations. The boy was a curse, a vessel, a walking judgment upon a town that had grown soft and forgetful of its own hidden sins. Fear no longer simmered. It boiled. Constable James Garrett, a practical man who preferred rifles and handcuffs to talk of demons, felt the pressure like a noose tightening around his own neck. Petitions were signed. Women wept in his office. Men threatened to take matters into their own hands if the law would not act. Finally, under the weight of collective hysteria, Garrett arrested Thomas Hartwell on the vague charge of suspicion of malicious harm through unnatural means. There was no statute for causing a stroke with a glance. But fear writes its own laws. Thomas did not resist. He did not shout his innocence or demand a lawyer. He simply stood, hands loose at his sides, and allowed the constable to lead him away to the small brick jailhouse built only 5 years earlier. As the iron door clanged shut, witnesses swore the boy looked almost relieved. As though this too was a step he had long foreseen on a path only he could see. The trial opened in May 1848 in the county courthouse 20 miles away. Newspapers from Montgomery and even as far as Mobile sent reporters. The air in the packed room smelled of sweat, fear, and the faint sweetness of pipe tobacco. Everyone sensed this was more than a legal proceeding. It was an exorcism the town desperately needed. The prosecution's case rested entirely on pattern and timing. Witness after witness took the stand. Farmers described the geometrically arranged corpses of livestock, their voices shaking as they recalled the unnatural precision. Mothers spoke of children who had crossed Thomas and then suffered inexplicable accidents or illnesses. Samuel Hutchkins recounted seeing the boy carrying a dead animal in the dead of night. Martha Hicks, mother of the boy who broke his leg, swore she had seen pure malevolence in Thomas's stare the day her son was thrown from the horse. It was not a boy's eyes, she said, voice cracking. It was something looking out through him. The centerpiece was Reverend Thornton's stroke. The timing, mere hours after that chilling smile, was presented as damning. The prosecutor painted Thomas as a predator who no longer needed knives or poison. His weapon was something darker: intent, will, perhaps a power granted by forces no Christian dared name aloud. Yet when pressed, the prosecution had almost nothing tangible. No physical evidence. No eyewitness to any direct act of violence. No confession. Only a tapestry of coincidence woven tight by terror. The defense, paid for by William Hartwell at great and ruinous cost, was led by a sharp-eyed lawyer named William Prescott. He dismantled the case methodically. Correlation is not causation, he argued. The town was persecuting a brilliant but eccentric boy simply because he refused to be ordinary. He reminded the jury of American ideals: innocence until proven guilty, protection from mob justice, the danger of superstition dressed as evidence. Then Thomas himself took the stand. The courtroom fell into a hush as the tall, lean 16-year-old rose. His dark hair was neatly combed. His clothing simple but clean. Those pale gray eyes scanned the room once, slowly, as though memorizing every face that had come to condemn him. He spoke calmly, articulately, without a trace of nervousness. On the dead animals, he admitted arranging some of them. He had found them already deceased in the woods and used the opportunity to study anatomy and decomposition. Death is the great recycler, he said flatly. I wish to understand how the body returns to the earth. It is no different from a natural philosopher dissecting a frog. The explanation was rational, almost scholarly, yet delivered with such icy detachment that it chilled the listeners more than any denial could have. He spoke of death the way other boys spoke of hunting or fishing. As science. As curiosity. As something beautiful in its order. On Margaret's disappearance, he had been in the forest that night, as was his custom. He heard her cries. He found her in a ravine where she had fallen. He kept her warm through the night and led her home at dawn. Again, reasonable. Again, delivered without a flicker of emotion, no relief, no brotherly concern, no horror at what his sister had endured. Just facts. Cold, precise facts. The jury and spectators shifted uncomfortably. The boy's lack of feeling made his reasonable words feel like lies wrapped in logic. The most damaging moment came from Martha Hricks again. She described seeing Thomas stare at her son with eyes full of hate so thick you could choke on it. She was certain he had willed the accident. Under cross-examination she admitted she had seen no gesture, no action, only the expression. Her testimony rested entirely on intuition and dread. Judge Harrison Cobb, known for his dry skepticism and fairness, looked visibly troubled. The evidence was gossamer. Legally, it should collapse. Yet the fear in the room was a living thing, pressing against the walls like floodwater. In closing, the prosecutor abandoned strict law and appealed to something older: the duty of a community to protect its children, its faithful, its future. Even if we cannot name the exact crime, he thundered, we know in our bones this boy is a threat. Will you wait until more suffer before you act? The defense countered that convicting on fear alone would betray every principle the young nation claimed to hold dear. The jury deliberated for 2 long, sweltering days. When they returned, the foreman announced they were deadlocked. 6 believed Thomas guilty of something monstrous. 6 believed the evidence too weak to destroy a boy's life. Mistrial. Thomas was released. But the trial had done its damage far beyond any verdict. The region now knew his name. Newspapers carried headlines that painted Milbrook as a town haunted by a boy who might be touched by the devil. Back home, Thomas was no longer merely suspected. He had been publicly tried and had walked free on a technicality. In the eyes of the town, that made him worse, a clever monster who had slipped the noose of justice. The isolation became absolute. No invitations. No conversations. Children were yanked away when he passed. Shopkeepers served him in silence, eyes averted. He walked the streets like a living plague flag. Then the real torment began. Not ambiguous accidents this time. Something sharper. More personal. A campaign that felt deliberate. Eleanor Vance, the same girl Thomas had rescued years earlier, began to unravel. She became convinced Thomas was inside her mind, watching her every thought. She saw his face in crowds where he was absent. She woke to his voice whispering her name in the dark. Her anxiety spiraled into full paranoia. Eventually her family had no choice but to send her to the asylum in Montgomery. She would spend the rest of her days there, rocking in a corner, muttering about gray eyes that never blinked. Robert Thorne, whose livestock had been arranged in geometric patterns, fell into a mysterious fever. He babbled in tongues no one recognized, describing visions of black pines that bled and animals that screamed in human voices. Dr. Vance found no physical cause. Thorne recovered enough to sell his farm and flee the county, but his mind never fully returned. Samuel Hutchins, the boy who had first accused Thomas of carrying a dead goat, developed a violent lung infection. He coughed bright arterial blood for weeks. Prayers filled his bedside. He survived, but as a broken shadow of himself, lungs scarred, unable to do the heavy work that defined a man in Alabama. He would live as a semi-invalid, bitterness his only constant companion. The pattern was unmistakable to the terrified townspeople. Those who had spoken against Thomas, testified, or simply crossed him were being broken one by one. Some began wearing crosses or carrying Bible verses sewn into their clothing, hoping divine protection would shield them from whatever power the boy wielded. Others avoided even looking in his direction. Constable Garrett shadowed Thomas whenever he entered the woods, but the boy remained polite, cooperative, and utterly uncaught. He gave the law nothing. Inside the Hartwell home, the family was disintegrating. William Hartwell's health collapsed under the weight of debt, shame, and endless defense of his son. A persistent cough turned bloody. Dr. Vance diagnosed consumption. The once strong carpenter wasted away before their eyes, frame shrinking, eyes fever bright. Catherine retreated entirely into her room. She ate little, spoke less. Neighbors who glimpsed her said she looked like a woman being slowly devoured from within by a truth too terrible to name. Her eyes carried the haunted glaze of someone who had seen the face of judgment and recognized it in her own child. Through it all, Thomas continued his routines with eerie serenity. School when it was held. Long hours in the forest. Silent meals at a table heavy with unspoken accusation. He seemed untouched by his family's suffering, by the town's hatred. At 17 he had become, in the collective imagination of Milbrook, something that had outgrown humanity. Yet the final revelation, the one that would twist the knife deepest, began on a stifling summer afternoon in 1848. Catherine Hartwell, confined to her sickbed for months with what the doctor called a nervous condition bordering on madness, suddenly called for Constable Garrett. Her voice, weak but clear for the first time in weeks, carried through the house like a deathbed confession. She had something to say. Something about her son. Something that would finally explain everything, or shatter the last illusions the town still clung to. The pines outside seemed to lean closer that day, listening. The river ran slower, as though holding its breath. And somewhere in the red clay beneath Milbrook, old sin stirred, waiting for the words that would either grant them peace, or set them free to claim every soul who had dared to judge what they could never comprehend. The parlor in the Hartwell house smelled of camphor, old wood, and the faint metallic tang of impending death. Constable James Garrett sat across from Catherine Hartwell on a horsehair settee that had seen better decades. The afternoon light slanted through threadbare curtains, painting everything in sickly gold. William lay coughing in the next room, his lungs slowly filling with the fluid that would soon drown him. Margaret stayed hidden upstairs, still carrying the silence of the forest in her bones. And somewhere outside, perhaps watching from the tree line, was Thomas. Catherine's hands trembled as she spoke. Her voice was a fragile thread, but the words carried the weight of years of swallowed poison. From the cradle, he was wrong, she whispered. He never cried for comfort the way other babies do. When I held him, he studied my face like I was an insect under glass. No warmth. No need. Only observation. As he grew, the difference sharpened. Other children laughed, fought, wept. Thomas watched. When a bird broke its wing in the yard, he would sit for hours beside it, noting every twitch, every shallow breath, as though cataloging suffering for a private ledger. When playmates scraped knees or lost fights, he observed their tears with the same cool detachment a surgeon might show a tumor. Intelligence burned in him, brighter than any child I had ever seen, but it was cold fire. Untethered from mercy. Untethered from God. She had tried to tell William. Her husband had waved it away as the imagination of an overprotective mother. The boy is gifted, he would say. This town is too small to understand him. He will outgrow it. He will go north. Become a scholar. William clung to pride the way drowning men cling to driftwood. Catherine had known better. Something essential was missing in her firstborn son, the invisible thread that binds human hearts to one another. Empathy. Conscience. The fear of divine judgment that keeps most souls from becoming monsters. When the dead animals began appearing in geometric precision across the pastures, Catherine found the sketches hidden beneath Thomas's mattress, meticulous diagrams of the very arrangements the farmers had discovered, notes on rigor mortis, decomposition rates, the way flesh separated from bone. She burned some. Hid others. But she said nothing. She told herself silence might starve the darkness. That if she pretended not to see, the behavior might wither. It did not. When Margaret vanished that freezing December night, Catherine's terror nearly broke her. She lay awake imagining horrors no mother should voice. When Thomas led the men straight to the girl beneath the oak, unharmed in body but shattered in spirit, Catherine allowed herself a desperate, fragile hope. Perhaps the worst was over. Perhaps he had only wanted to prove something. The hope died with every new misfortune that followed. The broken leg. The raging infection. The nightmares. The stroke that stole Reverend Thornton's strength. Each time, Thomas had been nearby. Each time, he had positioned himself perfectly so that terrified eyes would connect the dots he never had to draw himself. And then came Catherine's devastating revelation, the truth that hollowed her out more completely than any supernatural explanation ever could. Thomas had not killed the animals with his own hands, at least not most of them. He had not caused the accidents through sorcery or demonic gaze. He had not invaded minds or summoned fevers. He had done something infinitely more chilling. He had weaponized the town's own fear. He understood human nature the way a chess master understands the board. He knew how superstition spreads faster than truth in tight-knit communities. He knew how a single suggestive glance, a well-timed presence, a small smile at the exact moment of crisis could ignite collective hysteria. He let people believe he possessed unholy power, and then stepped back while their terror did all the real work. The boy who fell from the horse? A simple startled animal in poor riding. But Thomas had stood in the road, locked eyes, and allowed the story to bloom into witchcraft. Eleanor Vance's descent into madness? The lingering trauma of her childhood disappearance, amplified by a town that now saw devils everywhere. Reverend Thornton's stroke? A medical tragedy that would have happened regardless, but the smile Thomas gave him at the church door became the final spark in a powder keg of guilt and dread the preacher had been carrying for weeks. Thomas had not needed supernatural gifts. He only needed to understand that frightened people will finish the story for you, and they will make it far darker than you ever could. Why? Catherine had no complete answer, but her theory carried the chill of biblical truth. Thomas was running an experiment. Not on animals this time, but on an entire community. He wanted to see how far fear could bend good Christian souls. How quickly neighbors would turn on one another. How readily a town that sang hymns on Sunday would accuse a child of being the devil on Monday. He had orchestrated his own demonization with cold, patient genius, positioning himself to be seen at the right moments, planting small seeds of suggestion, then watching the harvest of panic grow wild and uncontrollable. And the town had performed perfectly. They had created the monster they feared. They had proven his thesis, that humanity's greatest weakness is not evil itself, but the terror of it. Constable Garrett sat in stunned silence. What Catherine described was not a crime the law could touch. There was no statute against psychological manipulation, against exploiting superstition, against becoming the living mirror of a community's hidden sins. Thomas had harmed no one directly. He had simply held up a mirror, and the reflection had driven them mad. Yet the danger felt more real than ever. A boy who could orchestrate the emotional destruction of an entire town without shedding blood was more terrifying than any witch or demon. Because demons can be cast out with prayer and holy water. This was something that walked on two legs, quoted scripture when it suited him, and understood the human heart better than the heart understood itself. Catherine's final words that afternoon carried the weight of a deathbed confession. I can no longer carry this alone. My husband is dying. My daughter is broken. My son I no longer recognize as flesh of my flesh. I needed one person to know the truth, even if it changes nothing. Even if justice cannot touch him. The stalemate that followed was its own form of torment. Garrett knew, or believed he knew, the shape of the truth. But he could arrest no one for the crime of being unerringly perceptive about fear. The town continued to fear Thomas, but the flavor of that fear had shifted from supernatural dread to something colder, more existential, the horror of realizing that the real monster might simply be a human mind unburdened by conscience, moving among them like a wolf that had learned to wear the shepherd's clothes. William Hartwell died in the autumn of 1848 as the leaves turned blood-red and fell like accusations. His final days were spent gasping for air that would not come, still murmuring weak defenses of his son even as death claimed him. It was, in many ways, a mercy. He would never have to watch the final act. Catherine aged overnight. She took in sewing to keep food on the table. Her eyes carried a permanent shadow, the look of a woman who had glimpsed the abyss in her own womb and survived only by half. Thomas attended his father's funeral with the same detached calm he brought to everything. He stood beside the grave as the dirt fell, face impassive, pale eyes reflecting the gray Alabama sky. No tears. No tremor in his voice when he spoke the required words. His indifference was perhaps the final, most biblical indictment. A son who could bury his father without mourning was a soul already walking in outer darkness. In the spring of 1849, Thomas announced he had been accepted to a university in the North. How a boy with no formal recommendations, no character witnesses, and a reputation that had spread like wildfire managed such acceptance remained a mystery. But the town did not question it. They celebrated it. He left in May, 17 years old, carrying a small trunk and a letter of introduction from a distant lawyer. No grand farewell. No final confrontation. He simply boarded the stagecoach one quiet morning and vanished into the dust of the road, as indifferently as he had lived among them. Relief swept through Milbrook like fresh river air after a long fever. The nightmare had ended. The boy who had poisoned their peace was gone. Catherine and Margaret remained. Catherine supported them with needle and thread, growing thinner and quieter with each passing year. Margaret never fully recovered her childhood brightness. She became a gentle, withdrawn woman who never married, never left the family home. She cared for her mother until the end, then lived on alone, tending the small garden and keeping a silent vigil over the house where one child had undone everything. The story did not die with Thomas's departure. For decades, Milbrook whispered about the Hartwell boy whenever the wind moved strangely through the pines or children disappeared for an afternoon. Debates raged in low voices. Some swore he had been genuinely touched by darkness, perhaps a power science could not yet name. Others insisted the town had manufactured a monster out of prejudice and fear, persecuting a brilliant but awkward boy until he had no choice but to play the role they wrote for him. Still others believed the truth lay in the gray space between, a troubled soul who had learned to survive by becoming the very shadow the community projected onto him. No records exist of Thomas Hartwell at any northern university. No trace of him appears in later censuses, professional registries, or newspaper accounts. It is as though he stepped off the stagecoach and dissolved into legend, another ghost the red clay of Alabama had quietly swallowed. But the real power of Thomas Hartwell was never in what he did or did not do with his hands. It was in the questions he left behind. Questions that still haunt the descendants of those 800 souls. Was he a predator who understood the human heart better than any preacher? Was he a victim of small-town ignorance that turned difference into devilry? Or was he something rarer and more chilling, a boy who discovered that the most potent force on earth is not violence, not even sin, but the fear of sin itself? And perhaps the deepest terror of all is this. In 1848, in a small Alabama town nestled between river and pine, one child held up a mirror to the community, and the community blinked first. They saw evil. They named it Thomas. But what if the evil was never in the boy? What if it was in the fear that made them need a boy to blame? The pines still stand. The river still flows red with clay. And on certain quiet nights, when the wind moves just right through the longleaf forest, some say you can still hear the faint echo of a question no one in Milbrook ever answered. Who was really on trial in 1848? The boy? Or the town that was afraid of him?